Assalamu alaikum friend, welcome back to my channel. Today we will be discussing an introduction to romantic literary criticism. Let's begin with the origin and timeline of the romantic literary criticism. It was first originated in Germany and later on spread to the rest of the Europe. And it is a literary movement which started in the latter decades of the 18th century, and on literary timeline the year 1798 marks the beginning of Romantic Age, and it was the year of publication of lyrical ballads. Now, manifesto of romanticism, or what was the gateway to the Romantic Age. So, publication of lyrical ballads in 1798 marked the birth of literary criticism. A preface was added to the 1800 publication that serves as manifesto of Romanticism. So, as the lyrical ballad, it was written before the preface. So, when later on the preface it was given by Wordsworth, so it became the manifesto of Romanticism, or it was a gateway to the Romantic Age. Poetic theory of Wordsworth discussed in this preface. So, the Wordsworth he has discussed his poetic theory in this preface, and he also gave the definition of poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings that the poetry collected in tranquility to produce poetry. So, characteristic of Romanticism, let's discuss it. So, it emphasized emotions and feelings. Romanticism, it was totally opposite to the previous age, in which was age of reason and logic. Now, in Romanticism, the focus was on emotions and feelings, and pleasure and indulgence were the spirit of the age. Anything that pleased the human senses was worth writing about. So romantics or the romantic poet, they all wrote about anything which pleased human senses. First one is imagination. So it was the key element of the romanticism, and the poets of the time they believed in power of human mind to imagine and then create literature. Then the second characteristic of this age is the individualism. So it was also an important element for poets of Romantic age, and was admiring nature and its beauty by a poet speaker, which was a hallmark of Romantics. And poet was individualist, lone traveler, or any solitary figure. For it comes the beauty. So it is the central idea of Romanticism. Nature had the power to inspire poetic creation. And then Romanticism inspired John Keats to seek pleasure in the beauty of nature. So John Keats, due to the Romantic age or this romantic movement, he started to seek pleasure in the beauty of nature. His statement was "Beauty is truth and truth is beauty", sums up the spirit of Romantic age, and use of heavy nature imagery was common to all Romantics. Then influence of French Revolution on the Romantic age. The historic French Revolution took place in 1789, and this revolution has affected the works of Romantic poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, and P.B. Shelley. Some writers were in favor of this revolution while some were disillusioned by it, and it inspired ideals of liberty and a revolutionary spirit that influenced Romanticism. Then comes the important writers and poets of the age. Some of the important writers of the age were William Wordsworth, Coleridge, John Keats, Jane Austen, P.B. Shelley, and Lord Byron. So the first three were the poets of the age, and Jane Austen, she has wrote many novels. P.B. Shelley and Lord Byron, both of them has worked on Gothic elements of novel. Then comes to the conclusion of the Romantic age. So Romanticism was thus an artistic movement that valued emotions and feelings. It sought to create art out of inspiration drawn from nature. Imagination, sentiments, beauty, and individualism were hallmarks of Romantic movement in literature. So now we will study just two main Romantic critics. First one is William Wordsworth as a Romantic critic. So he was born in 1770 in England, and he started the Romantic movement in English literature by publishing his work Lyrical Ballads. The preface that he added to the 1800 edition of this work became the manifesto of Romantic era and radical change in the way poetry was read and perceived. So, due to the work of the William Wordsworth, there was a radical change in the way poetry was read and perceived. The whole perspective was changed. The lyrical ballads and the preface. So it was a collaborative work with Coleridge and it was a landmark in the history of English literature. So majority of his work consisted of Wordsworth poems and poems were departed in style and subjected from poetry of new classical poets. Lyrical ballads were not in accordance with the conventions of poetry, as we already said that in the poetry there was a complete change and it was not following the conventions of poetry of that time. So Wordsworth wrote the preface in order to explain his choice of language and subjects. Now, what were the Wordsworth romantic ideas? So, he believed that the subject of poetry should be humble and rustic life. And then he said that poetry which dealt with the higher subject was superficial and it lacked depth. So the subject of poetry for Wordsworth had to be something common, familiar, ordinary, mundane, and rustic. So he said that poetry should deal with the ordinary objects, and the poet he should emphasize the common objects with the coloring of imagination. And then comes Wordsworth had attempted an experiment in the lyrical ballads and he had abandoned the conventional role-governed poetic style. We have already discussed that uh, he has totally ignored the poetic style of that time and there was a radical change in the way the poetry was read and perceived. So Wordsworth he decided or he has wrought in the real language of men and this language was most similar to the language of common people. Then by declaring that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, Wordsworth became the first significant voice of literary romanticism, and he also believed that poetry was born out of human emotions and his focus was on emotional and the affective aspects and it became the central or the main theme of romanticism. So neoclassical poets, there is a comparison given between the neoclassical poets and the Wordsworth poetry. So the poetry of neoclassical poets it sought to communicate with intellect while Wordsworth poetry it sought to communicate with the human emotions. Wordsworth's poetic theory it is also significant in the fact that it believed that poetry flowed spontaneously from the poet. So the new classical poet here and another comparison is given according to which the new classical poets they were obsessively concerned about the rules and diction of poetry, while Wordsworth he favored poetry that flowed naturally and another romantic poet John Keats he has wrote about this that if poetry comes not as naturally as leaves to a tree it had better not come at all. So he was in favor that poetry should come naturally to a poet. So pleasure was the central theme of the Romantic movement, and Wordsworth he noted that a poet was bound by the necessity of giving immediate pleasure to a human. Then comes the revolutionary zeal. The ideals of liberty and human rights were the topics of the hot debate at that time or in the French Revolution. So Wordsworth he declared in the prelude that bliss was it in that dawn to be alive but to be young was very heaven. So he has epitomized the concept of individuality more than any other poet of his age. He said that the romantic poet speaker was a self-indulgent observer. He said a speaker who wandered lonely as a cloud. This figure dwelt in solitude and his aloofness allowed his creative tendency to produce poetry of the romantic kind. Okay, so he has also talked about that it is not the nature which inspired a poet to write poetry, but it was the emotion recollected in tranquility to shape it into poetry. So he said that it was not the nature, or the poet was not unable to write the poetry at the moment when he just saw the things, but later on he wrote the poetry, or it was the emotion recollected in tranquility which has shaped it into poetry. Secondly, emotions were at the heart of Romanticism, so it was an artistic movement which needed the it was artistic movement and the need to feel and express emotion. And then, according to Wordsworth, it was this ability of the poet to feel strongly that enabled poetic creation. So Wordsworth, he's saying that it is the feeling or the emotions which are enabling the poetic creation. So he has noted in the preface that the poet is endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. So now what was the Wordsworth conception of nature and beauty? So he said that it was not the beauty of nature that inspired poetry, but it was the memory or the recollection of the nature that became a source of poetic creation. For example, the poet speaker in the Daffodils, he first observed the scenery and he observed the nature, the beauty of nature, and then recollected in tranquility the emotion that the sight had evoked, and then he wrote poetry on that particular nature, beauty of nature. Okay, same things discussed here. So thus it is not the immediate experiences but their memory that has the creative potential. Now let's sum up the Wordsworth Romanticism. Wordsworth was thus a true romantic poet. Though he was primarily a poet and not a critic, his preface to Lyrical Ballad it laid down his literary theory effectively. He made poetry accessible to the common man by making incidents and situations from common life and the subject of his poetry. So he believed that the poet's imagination had the power to make even the most ordinary subject seem extraordinary. Now let's discuss the second poet, which is the Samuel Taylor Coleridge as a romantic literary critique. We will discuss the same thing as we did for the William Wordsworth. For example, we will study about Coleridge and then his work Biographia Literaria, and then Coleridge's romantic ideas, and then his conception of nature, and then the conclusion. So now let's study about Coleridge. He was born in 1772 and he was also known as Sage of Highgate, and he was a close friend of William Wordsworth, and together they co-authored Lyrical Ballads. Coleridge contributed only 4 poems to this work, but they proved his artistic genius, and he belonged to the older Romantic poets. Coleridge he was addicted to opium and it has greatly affect his writing career, and like Wordsworth, Coleridge was also primarily a poet and not a critic, but his poetic theory can be traced from the ideas given in his 1817 work titled Biographia Literaria. Coleridge he was influenced by Kant, who was a German philosopher. Now let's discuss his work, which is Biographia Literaria. Coleridge is best known for his work Biographia Literaria, or Biographical Sketches of My Literary Life and Opinions, that was published in 1817, and it was autobiographical in nature, and his work also set forth the poet's literary theory. So, due to his addiction to opium, his poem it is loosely structured and contains much philosophy. Okay, now Coleridge romantic ideas. So, like a true romantic, Coleridge sought inspiration from nature. Just like Wordsworth, he has took inspiration from nature. Or now Coleridge, he was also a true romantic, and he has taken inspiration from nature as well. So he believed that nature can only inspire poetry, and he's saying that this inspiration it is supplied from the poet's mind. He's saying that this inspiration needs the imagination that is supplied by the poet's mind, so it was not nature alone, but how the poet chose to portray it using his imagination. He's saying now it depends on the poet. He can make things look more good or more lovelier. So thus Coleridge was of the opinion that outward work can only inspire poetry, but to shape it well the poet needs to seek help of his own imaginative faculties. This idea of Coleridge is echoed in Dejection and Ode as I may not hope from outward forms to win the passion and the life whose fountains are within. So he's saying that poetry comes from within, not from the outer world. Coleridge's romanticism it is best observed in his stress on the faculty of imagination. He has also focused on the imagination and he has distinguished this imagination from fancy, and he believed that imagination was the living power and prime agent of all human perception. And imagination is observable in many of his poems. So, okay, then comes he has also emphasized pleasure, just like Wordsworth. He has said that it is the poet is bound to give immediate pleasure to the humans. So, Coleridge, as a romanticist, he has also emphasized pleasure. Coleridge put forward his idea of the willing suspension of disbelief. He believed that for the reader to seek pleasure from a work of literature, the reader should be able to suspend his disbelief temporarily for the sake of artistic pleasure. He saying that readers should be willing to overlook or neglect consideration of the rational or logical aspects. So while reading a poetry, a common people they should just leave the rational and logical aspects for the sake of poetic faith and the prioritization of emotion and feeling over reason and logic. And then he has also discussed the beauty of nature, and then saying that no work of art can have an existence until perceived actively by the human mind, and the idea found an expression in the poet's famous lines, "O lady, we receive but what we give, and in our life alone does nature live." And he has also discussed the role of the mind to actively create and perceive things. So, he has also discussed that it is the primary imagination that holds the ability to perceive, and the secondary imagination merely works as an agent to organize what has been perceived by the primary imagination into a unified whole, and this unified whole is known as ism plastic. So, imagination is different from fancy because imagination is active and fancy is passive. This is a major distinction between fancy and imagination. So, imagination is a creative faculty, fancy is merely a repository. Now, what is the conception of nature of Coleridge? So, he was, as a romantic poet, he was fond of nature, and Keats admired nature for its beauty, and Wordsworth praised it for the memory it evoked in the observer. Coleridge considered nature to be full of mysteries. Nature fused with the supernatural in his poetry. So Wordsworth he has discussed that memory is everything which is leading a poet to write poetry, while according to Coleridge, he is saying that in nature it is full that nature is full of mysteries, and he has discussed the supernatural elements in his poetry. Then comes elements of nature were manifestation of some deeper truths. Example, albatross, he's saying it is not only a bird, but it is a symbol of guilt. For same goes for the nightingale's song and the rhyme of the ancient mariner. It reveals the unmerciful face of nature. His depiction of nature is thereby different from that by other romantic poets. His famous lines, "Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink," shows nature in crisis. Despite such seeming abundance, he's saying like we have water present everywhere, but it is not drinkable. So he is showing the crisis despite such seeming abundance. Then now we will just discuss the conclusion of Coleridge Romanticism. So Coleridge he saw nature not merely as a source of beautiful landscape and melodious birds but also full of risk and danger. He nonetheless sought inspiration from nature for his poetry, imagination, and the ability to actively perceive the world was central to his ideas of romanticism. He advocated a willing suspension of disbelief for the sake of pleasure, which was also the key concern for the Romantics. And with that, our lecture comes to an end. Thank you all for joining me and listening to me. Hope it's all clear. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.